Alan Watts was one of the most well-known and insightful writers in areas of Eastern Asian philosophy and meditation during the 20th century. He was widely recognized for his Zen writings, which can be seen in over 20 of his books, including The Way of the Zen, Psychotherapy East and West, and The Meaning of Happiness, and dozens of recorded lectures. Born in England on January 6, 1915, to a middle-class family, Alan was engaged in religious thought from an early age on. Heavily influenced by his mother's evangelical family and austerity, Watts was not indulged and raised to focus firmly on his education. Despite his mother's Anglican background, both parents were open to all religious beliefs. While a loving relationship with his mother was oftentimes lacking or distant, Alan and his father grew to be very close. Early on, Alan developed a love for the gardens and landscapes around his childhood cottage. Alan's curiosities in stories and artwork from the Far East also passionately emerged at a young age. His mother's drawing room, full of Oriental treasures, sparked much of his interest. From the idyllic surroundings of his childhood to Asian aestheticism around his home, nature became an all-encompassing theme early in his life and for the remainder of it. At the age of 7, Alan was enrolled in St. Hugh's, a nearby preparatory school. It was a quick shift from his Puritan upbringing to an all-boys school, which introduced him to sex, an interest that would linger for the rest of his life. Though an excellent student, Alan found school dull and uninspiring. Additionally, Alan missed the companionship of female friends. Learning to make do, Alan involved himself in sports and his studies. Watts then began attending King's College School at Canterbury, where he continued to pursue his education in classics and the arts. In his second year at King's, Watts was confirmed, but found the Christian ceremony to be meaningless. At the same time, he was taught to repress all forms of sexuality, something he was deeply inquisitive about. Oriental culture still fascinated Alan, and he slowly felt himself pulling away from the Christian milieu he grew up knowing. He wrote about Japanese culture for debate class, likely the first time Watts seriously studied Zen Buddhism. His fervor for Chinese and Japanese art and religion and deeper questioning of Christian beliefs led Alan at the age of 16 to become a Buddhist and leave behind the Anglican background of his youth. Although shocking to most of his family, Alan's father fully supported his decision. He quickly became a member and secretary of the London Buddhist Lodge that Christian Humphreys, the best-known British Buddhist, directed. It was during this period that he began to experiment with several meditative approaches. In addition to his duty as secretary, Alan wrote numerous essays expressing his personal philosophy that balanced individuality with self-expression. Still at King's College, Watts continued to develop his religious interests, performing yoga in his dormitory and studying Buddhist texts. Despite his teacher's hopes of attending Trinity College, Watts flunked the scholarship exam and pursued his future as a Buddhist. After attending King's College School at Canterbury and serving on the Council of the World Congress of Faiths, Watts worked with his father as a fundraiser at the Metropolitan Hospital Sunday Fund. Working only to make money, Watts was left with time to attend Buddhist lodge meetings. He felt Buddhism offered some release from the guilt of Christianity. During this time period, Watts came into contact with several well-known spiritual authors and theologians, including D.T. Suzuki, a scholar of Zen Buddhism, and Frederick Spiegelberg, an Oriental philosopher. Due to his many personal encounters and dedication to studying Buddhist literature, Watts learned a tremendous amount more about East Asian thought. At the age of 21, Watts got his first book published, The Spirit of the Zen. Watts spent his early adult years absorbing all he could. He also learned to read and write Mandarin Chinese and practice martial arts. He was still at the same time very interested to meet women and eager to discover the mysteries of sex. Watts eventually met Eleanor Everett, a wealthy woman whose mother Ruth was a practicing Buddhist and Zen expert. Alan was fascinated with Ruth and was able to remain close to her by dating Eleanor. Eleanor also provided the missing piece of Alan's sexual desires. They married and moved to the United States in 1938. Soon after their move, Watts found himself attracted to Christian ideas once again. He found the need to resolve issues of his childhood religion with his adopted religion. He hoped to both recover the lost mysticism of Christianity and to integrate it with other religions. Watts was also unemployed, and embracing his skills as a theologian, thought becoming a priest was a convenient and beneficial career change. Hence, in the early 1940s, Watts entered an Anglican school in Evanston, Illinois. After excelling in his studies for several years, he was ordained an Episcopal priest. He eventually took the position of chaplain at Northwestern University. A well-known figure around campus, Watts offered peer counseling, educational programs, and also ran a retreat house where he lived with Eleanor, called Canterbury House. At the same time, Alan's preoccupation with sex and erotic fantasies was becoming extreme and draining his marriage. His constant sexual demands on Eleanor and obsession with pornography were overbearing. She became depressed and took much of her anger out on their 2 children. The marriage was no longer happy. Both Alan and Eleanor began extramarital affairs, Alan's becoming an eternal habit. To avoid community gossip, the shock and disappointment of his parents, and the inevitable dismissal by the church over various sexual scandals, Alan left Evanston while his children left with Eleanor separately. He quickly remarried a graduate student, Dorothy DeWitt, who had been a babysitter for his children. Suddenly an outsider in the Christian community, Watts rediscovered his Buddhist beliefs and moved to California, joining the staff of the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco. His 2 daughters decided to join him in California, and despite their having a new baby, Alan remained unfaithful to Dorothy. It was at this point that Watts began to devote himself solely to the study of Eastern philosophy and meditation and on Zen Buddhism. Zen, the mystical school of Buddhism, was seen by Alan Watts as a vehicle to manipulate the consciousness. In the mid-1950s, Watts left the Academy of Asian Studies to begin a freelance career, later heading a local radio program in Berkeley and publishing his most classic and famous book, The Way of Zen, which focused on exposing the intricacies of Zen philosophy. He also published Nature, Man, and Woman, an expose of sexuality and gender. Meanwhile, as Watts had his 6th child, his marriage to Dorothy was souring. Alan took several years to travel through Europe, where he gave lectures at the C.G. Jung Institute, spoke in Cambridge, visited his parents in London, and relaxed at Jung's lakeside home at Küsnacht. It was during this time period that Watts was spending nearly all his time away from home and was drinking heavily. While teaching in New York, he met Mary Jane Yates, nicknamed Jano, a student whom he gradually fell in love with. Watts then left his family and pregnant Dorothy, a decision his father saw as a failure as a husband and father. San Francisco in the 1960s was a mecca of counterculture, as Watts describes. Something was on the way, in religion, in music, in ethics, and sexuality, in our attitudes toward nature, and in our whole style of life. We took courage and began to swing. Watts jumped into the Bohemian world, much of which had origins in Eastern religion. Ideas about Zen Buddhism had been explored before Watts by a group known as the Beats, or Poets of San Francisco. They focused on living in poverty, their religious beliefs, and free love. Jack Kerouac, a Beat Generation legend and acquaintance of Watts, wrote several books pushing the young, hippie crowd to pursue new ideas and religions. The 2 men were not terribly fond of each other, however their shared vision encouraged values of the bourgeois life. Following a short fellowship at Harvard University, Watts reached out to the progressive American college mass by lecturing around the country during the late 60s. Most religious academics, however, found Watts' philosophy too vague. By the early 1970s, ongoing experiments at the University of California, Los Angeles had introduced Alan to the world of psychedelic drugs. While not a fan of drug use, his experiences while on LSD were rewarding and offered him new insight into his life. Many of his books published during the late 1960s and early 1970s document his drug usage. In addition, these years introduced Watts to the more modern disciplines emerging around him. His interest shifted to the comparison between Eastern theology and contemporary science and psychology. Watts aptly connected ideas of science and Eastern philosophy with everyday notions, such as happiness and longevity. While he also revisited the mysticism of the environment, Watts sought to learn more useful and applicable methods of thinking. By the end of the decade, many influenced by Watts and his contemporaries had shifted from drug use, free sex, and rock music to an interest in Zen meditation. In 1969, Watts and Jano moved to Druid Heights, a beautiful and secluded site where many of their friends were living. He was suffering from fatigue and an ongoing drinking problem. Watts said at one point, "If I don't drink, I don't feel sexy." He was also still incapable of having a monogamous relationship, and life became difficult for Jano, causing her to drink heavily as well. Watts did, however, rekindle a relationship with his children, an extremely significant and meaningful development in his life. As Watts grew older, he found the notion of tolerance and humanity influencing his thoughts in daily life. He preached for international peace, cultural and individual tolerance. While he sought to believe in the positive aspects of humanity and nature, Watts expressed a growing concern for the fate of the environment in the hands of man. He also developed a newfound interest in Taoism. Despite failing health, Watts continued to lead the life of a young man, going to parties, staying up late, and drinking and smoking heavily. At some instances, his lectures would appear uncoordinated and incoherent because of his drunken state. After suffering financial obstacles and subsequently alcohol addiction, Watts died at home in 1973. His complex life was an adventurous path, laden with